Hello everybody and welcome back to another brand new episode of Mega Projects. This one is highly anticipated, Air Force One, the massive plane used by the President of the United States. Well, it's not that massive. I mean, it is massive, but it's a Boeing 747, a specially modified one. But it is absolutely insane. We previously made a video here about the President's car, the Beast. It did really well. Planes do really well, so hopefully lots of people are watching this video. Welcome! But just before we get into it today, I do want to say that this video is brought to you by Conflict of Nations, a free online strategy game that gathers millions of players worldwide. You fight up to 64 other players in real-time games that can take weeks to complete. The game is set in the early 21st century and features modern-day weapons and technology. Your objective is simple: take over the world. Define your strategy. Build powerful armies by combining dozens of different types of infantry, tanks, and yes, of course, planes, and fight for world domination in a challenging PvP environment. If real-time Modern Warfare sounds like your sort of game, you can join a huge community of millions of players in the game and on Discord and use your diplomatic skills to forge alliances with other players. Everything is fully optimized for cross-platform gaming. Play with the same account on both PC and mobile. So if this sounds like your sort of game, we've set up a game of Conflict of Nations where the first group of viewers that click the link in the description can jump into a special Mega Projects round of Conflict of Nations. Just go to the website or app, type my name in the search bar and enter the password. Slots are limited, so don't lose any time. And as a special bonus, you guys are going to receive a special gift when you click the link below. You can snag 13,000 gold and 1 month of a premium subscription for free. So click the link in the description, choose a country, and get started! In many ways, it has become as iconic as the very house in which the President of the United States resides, a home away from home, a flying fortress capable of sustaining the nation's government if the worst was to happen. The name Air Force One is known around the world, a gleaming symbol of American might and prestige. The title does not apply to a single plane, but rather acts as the call sign for any aircraft with the US President on board. There are currently 2 heavily customized Boeing VC-25As, which act as Air Force One, and as you might imagine, they come with the epitome of modern technology and defense capabilities. But the story of Air Force One stretches back decades to the eve of World War II. It has become an indispensable part of the American story, and one that has seen plenty of drama along the way. So let's look into it. The scene often plays out the same. The President appears at the top of a set of stairs on the runway, a cheery wave greeting the crowd gathered below. This is the standard image of Air Force One that we see time and time again. A regal chariot of the skies that has become a true symbol of the United States. You can imagine just how impressive an entrance this must be to those who witness it. But perhaps what we don't realize is that one of the 2 Boeing VC-25As must be fueled and ready to depart in a moment's notice. Should there be some kind of catastrophic incident, the President needs to have an emergency escape route on standby. This is not simply a lavish ceremonial aircraft. Aboard Air Force One is everything that a president needs to ensure the continuation of government. With a dazzling selection of communication devices, it can function easily as a mobile command center if the need arises. The electronics are designed to withstand an electromagnetic pulse, while the aircraft can also be refueled mid-flight. If needed, Air Force One can stay airborne for a considerable amount of time. That might all sound a little like a doomsday scenario, but considering the kind of hypothetical apocalyptic plans that were hatched during the Cold War, you can understand why such procedures are in place. Before World War II, US presidents rarely used aircraft. In fact, presidents rarely even ventured outside of the country. The kind of grand global events, complete with the slightly awkward photo shoots when leaders from around the world jostle for position while making every attempt to appear like they're not jostling for position, were infrequent to say the least. Even within the confines of national borders, it was much more common to find presidents traveling by train than by aircraft. Though he was no longer in office at the time, Theodore Roosevelt became the first president, sitting or past, to ever fly on board an aircraft in 1910. And when I say aircraft, I mean one of those early Wright flyers that now looks like something you might be able to purchase as a DIY aircraft. As you would have it was his fifth cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who became the first sitting president to venture into the skies. While a Douglas Dolphin, an amphibious flying boat, was officially the first aircraft to be purchased in 1933 for the specific role of transporting the president, it's not exactly clear whether FDR ever actually used it. His early recorded flights were not on board a heavily protected, modified aircraft like we see today, but on commercial airliners, minus the commercial passengers. In 1943, it took 3 separate legs for a Pan Am Boeing 314 flying boat to transport the president to the Casablanca Conference in Morocco. The idea of the President of the United States flying commercial sounds far-fetched today. The Secret Service in the 1940s began to feel equally apprehensive, especially with the outbreak of World War II. The first pick for a dedicated Air Force One submitted by the Air Force was a C-87A, a transport aircraft based on the same shape and style of a B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. It was given the call sign Guess Where To, which may have been getting a little ahead of themselves. After a thorough review, the aircraft was rejected outright by the Secret Service, both on the grounds of its poor safety record, but also that it seems that somebody twigged that having the president on board an aircraft that carried all the hallmarks of a bomber capable of unleashing hell below might not be a great idea. Guess Where To hadn't even made it into service, and already it was out, for the president at least. The aircraft went on to transport several members of his administration and even the president's wife in 1944 before it was officially retired in 1945. In its place, a Douglas C-54 Skymaster was chosen as the first official presidential aircraft. Nicknamed the Sacred Cow, the Douglas aircraft only transported FDR once to the Yalta Conference in Crimea in March 1945. 2 months later, FDR was dead, the result of a massive intracerebral hemorrhage. He was replaced as president by Harry S. Truman, who in 1947 also changed the presidential plane to a C-118 Liftmaster, which he named Independence after the Missouri town he was from. Truman was followed by Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1953 alongside another change in aircraft. At this point, not 1, not 2, but 4 aircraft were added to the presidential fleet. This included 2 Lockheed C-121 Constellations, which became Columbine 2 and Columbine 3. If you're wondering what happened to the first Columbine, I'm afraid we can't help you there, but we can tell you that the name Columbine comes from the state flower of Colorado, which was the adopted state of Eisenhower's wife, Mammy. Alongside the 2 larger Constellation aircraft were 2 smaller aircraft known as Aero Commanders, which could be used for short journeys. But it was Columbine 2 which holds the distinction of being the first ever aircraft to carry the call sign Air Force One. The iconic name we know today came about because of an incident that took place in the skies above New York City in 1953. That day, 2 aircraft appeared in close proximity, one carrying President Eisenhower with the call sign Air Force 8610, and another, a passenger airliner with the call sign Eastern Airlines 8610. You can probably see where I'm going with this. Air traffic control, who had no idea that a plane carrying the president was in their airspace, managed to confuse the 2 aircraft, leading to both being directed to the same vicinity. How close they came to one another, we aren't exactly sure, but the confusion and near miss led to the conclusion that the president's plane needed its own unique call sign, and thus the name Air Force One was born. In 1959, towards the end of Eisenhower's second term, Air Force One entered the jet age. 3 Boeing 707-120s were added to the fleet and were designed as SAMs, Special Air Missions 970, 971, and 972. It was on board SAM 970 that Eisenhower made his Flight to Peace Goodwill tour in December 1959, visiting 11 Asian nations in just 19 days, totaling 35,000 kilometers, distances that would have been inconceivable just a couple of decades before. In 1962, now under the presidency of John F. Kennedy, yet another aircraft was purchased by the Air Force, this time a Boeing C-137 Stratoliner, which became SAM 26000. This modified aircraft cost $8 million, which is $68.9 million today when it arrived, but JFK was said to have reservations over the decor both inside and out. He described it as too regal and recruited French-born American industrial designer Raymond Loewy to design a new exterior for the aircraft. At this point, point, the aircraft had plenty of red and gold with the nation's name emblazoned in capital letters along the side, so you can probably see why JFK thought it was a bit too much. Lowy chose to go with two separate shades of blue, a slate blue, which was supposed to represent the early republic, while a cyan shade represented the present and the future. The text design was also changed, with Lowy going back to the Declaration of Independence to see how the nation's name was first printed. He found that it had been written in uppercase in Caslon typeface with slightly more spacing than normal. The same text design was used on the aircraft, and very little has changed in the subsequent years. While there are countless images of Air Force One, both inside and out, perhaps the most iconic remains an image that was taken on the 22nd of November 1963. Hours earlier, JFK had been assassinated as his open-top car moved slowly through Dallas. While there were reservations about how quickly the new president should be sworn in as a matter of respect, the decision was made to go ahead with a ceremony on board Air Force One. The picture of Lyndon B. Johnson being sworn in as he stands next to Jackie Kennedy with her husband's blood still streaked across her coat is a powerful image, and one that was designed to show that despite the horror of the day, the continuation of the presidential power, and indeed of the government, was already in place. One can only imagine what must have been going through Jackie Kennedy's mind at this point, her face a mixture showing both sadness and vacantness. As Air Force One climbed into the sky that day on its return to Washington, D.C., it carried a new sitting president and the body of the previous. In 1972, that model was replaced by SAM 27000, a Boeing C-137 Stratoliner. Richard Nixon's time in office came with two interesting stories during his time on Air Force One. In June 1974, while on a scheduled trip to Syria, how times have changed, the aircraft was suddenly joined in the sky by Syrian fighter jets. Unfortunately, this was a classic example of what happens when you don't communicate well. The fighter jets had been dispatched to escort Air Force One into Syria, but the problem was that nobody had told the pilots on the presidential aircraft. As you might expect, Air Force One began evasive maneuvers to try and shake off the jets. Astonishingly, this went on for the next 7 minutes, with Air Force One pilot Colonel Ralph D. Abertazzi banking the aircraft violently left and right before going into a steep dive. Finally, communication got through to the cockpit that the fighter jets were, in fact, friendly aircraft, and Air Force One landed safely in Damascus. The second story regarding Nixon came just hours after he had resigned the presidency and led to the peculiar case of an aircraft changing its call sign mid-flight. Despite no longer being president, the aircraft which took Nixon to California that day was still designated as Air Force One when it left Washington. However, while it was mid-air, President Ford was sworn in, leading to Colonel Abertazzi requesting that air traffic control in Kansas City change the aircraft's call sign from Air Force One to SAM 27000 as it traveled across Kansas. Under Ronald Reagan, two Boeing 747s were purchased, but did not arrive until his predecessor, George H.W. Bush, was in office. These aircraft saw numerous technological upgrades, and for the first time, Air Force One would be protected from an electromagnetic pulse, which we'll come to shortly when we discuss the latest version. If we're talking about iconic photos, the moment George Bush was informed of the attacks on 9/11 while sitting in a classroom in Florida is another that stands out. While the events of that day are well known, what happened to Air Force One immediately after this photo less so. The president was immediately rushed onto the waiting aircraft and into the sky. Shortly after, a radio message was received that said Air Force One was entering airspace with multiple aircraft in it, one of which was not responding to radio calls. At that point, there were still many questions about exactly what had happened and whether it was all over. An unspecified threat had come through saying that Angel, the classified call sign of Air Force One, would be the next target. The decision was made to take Air Force One out across the Gulf of Mexico to see if the mystery aircraft followed. It did not, and later it was found that the transponder aboard the commercial airliner had malfunctioned and the crew had not switched to an alternative radio band. Air Force One landed at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, then at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, where President Bush gave a short speech. The specific threat to Angel was later discovered to be a miscommunication, but that day, nobody was taking anything for granted. Okay, so we're pretty much up to date. So let's take a closer look at the modern Air Force One. Firstly, this is a giant of an aircraft, built over 2 stories and totaling 371 square meters inside. When used for commercial use, this kind of aircraft can accommodate over 400 people, but on Air Force One, that number is only 70. It is 70.6 meters long and has a wingspan of 59.64 meters. Inside, Air Force One has living quarters for the president and family, conference rooms, which double as dining rooms, as well as office space for those lucky enough on board to have one. A typical overseas trip on board Air Force One will include the presidential staff, selected media, and of course the battalion of Secret Service who protect the president. Those on board can stay connected via any of the 85 phone lines on the aircraft while staying up to date with one of the 19 televisions on Air Force One. Its fuel capacity means it can travel about a quarter of a way around the world before needing to refuel, something it can do while airborne. As I mentioned earlier, Air Force One is protected against an electromagnetic pulse, an EMP, with the entire front section of the aircraft essentially a reinforced EMP shield, while all electronics on board come with their own individual protection. In terms of self-defense, this is also a quite extraordinary aircraft. I must say here, this hasn't been verified for obvious reasons. The US government doesn't want the world to know how they defend Air Force One, but there have been rumors of an airborne laser system, ABL, on board, which is a high-energy laser weapon system designed to destroy incoming ballistic missiles. Unfortunately, we can't give you any more details on that, but it does sound, well, wonderfully futuristic. Air Force One comes with its own medical facility, which can be turned into an operating theater at a moment's notice, while it's reported that 2,000 meals are always kept on board in case of emergency. The crew of 26 and 2 separate galleys can rustle up a gourmet spread for everybody on board and serve it all pretty much simultaneously. This is a well-oiled operation, as you have probably guessed by now. For such a large aircraft, it is also fast. Air Force One is capable of speeds of up to Mach 0.85, and it has a service ceiling of 13,747 meters, which is about 45,100 feet, both of which are comparable to commercial 747s. You probably won't be surprised to hear that flying something like this does not come cheap. During the Obama presidency, and we assume it's roughly the same now, Air Force One cost taxpayers an extraordinary $206,337 per hour to operate. In 2015, it was announced that 2 Boeing 747-8s would become the new presidential aircraft, but once the estimated cost of $4 billion became public, the Air Force began looking for cheaper alternatives. It seems that the government had purchased 2 747-8s from a bankrupt Russian airline company. These 2 aircraft have never been flown and are about as close to new as second-hand can be. It's not entirely clear when these new aircraft will enter service or how much they will eventually cost after modifications. It was also announced in September 2020 that the Air Force is seeking to incorporate supersonic technology into Air Force One. Again, we have no idea when this will be implemented, but the US government has already signed contracts with 3 separate companies to begin development. So watch this space. Air Force One, the most well-protected modern passenger airliner in the world, will be adding supersonic travel to its dazzling array of capabilities. Things have certainly come a long way from that rickety Wright Flyer just over 100 years ago. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you for watching.